All right. First rule of the channel, we not talk about the channel. Second rule of the channel, this is not legal advice. So this is going to be the 2024 quarterback target positional breakdown video, something along those lines of whatever I called the running back video. In this case, I've been having a little bit of problems figuring out a way to explain the strategy. I just sent an email to my co-manager in my main money league detailing that half the quarterbacks that were spent on last year in fantasy, like they busted out. So again, that meta, the old meta, that is still a part of fantasy football, we're right about half of it. We're wrong about the other half, and this is what we're going to detail because this is Eddie Guerrero, and if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. From a fantasy football perspective, we know what the cheat code is for quarterback. That's rushing yards, because the other thing that we want is total touchdowns. Touchdowns end up being very volatile on a year-to-year basis. So they are much less predictive as a whole, as opposed to just generally knowing like what are the chances that guy's going to get like more rushing yards. The passing yardage ends up being like kind of moot when you look at the rushing yards and the total touchdowns, because again, we can convert from a fantasy perspective, we can convert rushing yardage into total points, which ends up being equal to higher passing yardage totals. So those two things, the rushing yardage can make up for lack of passing yards, and then total touchdowns. More rushing touchdowns are better than more passing touchdowns, if that makes any sense to anybody out there. And that's what we're going to be generally looking at, because I need to figure out a way to win my league, and I need to block my opponents from having league-winning quarterbacks, because quarterbacks generally tend to score more points than any other positions that are out there. So allowing league-winning quarterbacks to hit the open market is generally not going to be a good idea for me to be able to win my leagues if I can appropriately identify like league-winning upside. Moving on to this, and I do want to talk a little bit about Anthony Richardson. I don't necessarily think Anthony Richardson has the ability to break fantasy the way some of the other pundits out there think that he can. I do think that he has a very high ceiling, and I think that he is appropriately cost or appropriately valued relative to his range of outcomes and his ability to go compete with the elite level quarterbacks that may have, like a Josh Allen, that may have a higher passing total. And Anthony Richardson can go compete with the rushing aspect of it. So he's going to be competitive at the cost. If he was like quarterback 3, I'd probably say no, but he's going like quarterback 5, 6, 7, and he's going in the right range. Unfortunately, with Anthony Richardson, I think he's going to be, people are going to go up and snipe him early because of that theoretical upside that he has. But this is a guy, because of that upside, if he can get into that like sub elite or elite, or I shouldn't say sub elite, if he can get into that elite range of guys, bringing this up, if he can get into this Josh Allen tier, again, your scoring settings and my scoring settings may be a little bit different, but if he can get up to about like 24 points a game, he's going to be a league winner. If he falls into this Jalen Hurts, Dak Prescott, like and below tier Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson last year were punts at the price that they were going at. Like there just wasn't a large enough difference between Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson and Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, or our good friend, the league winner of all league winners, Joe Flacco. So again, if you were the guy in your league that snuck your way into the playoffs, and then picked up Joe Flacco for the playoff run, you objectively had a better strategy than the guy who spent on Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson. Now, am I saying that the strategy of going up and getting like elite quarterback is a bad idea? No, I'm not. I'm actually going to say that's the opposite of what you should be doing in your leagues. What I would be doing in my leagues, my main money league last year, this was the first year that I had an elite quarterback, and it was that peace of mind was really nice, even though I will say it was not the best way. The way I've won my championships in the past is by punting the position and finding the guy off the waiver wires. Like Ryan Tannehill will always be a saint to me because I won my first chip with Ryan Tannehill as my starting quarterback 9 that year. So just understanding how this is going to go down. I have this 2014 breakout. Like we're going to time travel maybe a little bit today if I feel like it. But in this case, like this old meta of like Aaron Rodgers finishing as like the quarterback 1 with 22.1 points a game, like this is still part of fantasy football, because the idea is, well, there just isn't that big of a difference between me getting quarterback 1 and me getting like quarterback 12. Well, that changed when we get to our 2019 season, where we have good old Lamar Jackson, who is basically either going undrafted or going as a late round dart throw. And then he goes out and breaks fantasy. He does 28.1 points a game. And if we convert his rushing yards into passing yards, that means that he had 6,000 passing yards on the season. So just get a general understanding that a 4,000-yard passer with 400 yards rushing is equal to a 5,000-yard passer with like 0 rushing yards. So Lamar Jackson coming out of 2019, the discussion in 2020 was, hey, should he be the 1-0-1 in one quarterback leagues, right? And I will answer that question real fast when we start talking about the quarterback position, is because chasing touchdowns is a bad way to predict what's going to happen in the future. So Lamar Jackson, he busted out, and you could say like, well, that's injury, this, that, and the other. It's also generally that like he had a good year at 22.8 points a game. He didn't have 28 points a game, and that's where it kills you. Now, we could go all the way back to 2013 when we look at like what actual high volume passing totals are, when Peyton Manning does almost 5,500 yards passing in a 16 game season, and he does 55 touchdowns to go with negative 31 yards rushing in 1 touchdown. So with scoring down across the league and Tua leading all quarterbacks with 4,600 yards passing and Dak leading all quarterbacks with 36 touchdown passes, if you know something that we don't on who's going to be the league MVP, you should go to Vegas and you should bet on that, because otherwise you're betting on ranges of outcomes. And I really don't like tiering quarterbacks together or tiering players together from a fantasy football perspective, because I'm not buying a tier. I'm buying a guy's individual story, and that story is going to be different for everybody. So when I start looking at the different guys, like I see Rachaad White as having the possibility of having a legendary outcome season. So the same thing from a quarterback perspective. I don't see the road for certain guys to get certain places equally to other guys, even if they're in the same tier group. And being able to get a tier group of guys that are going to be, from a fantasy perspective, having the same outcome from a rushing perspective and a total touchdown perspective is much different than tiering guys together from another position and saying that they're going to have the same amount of total points. Like, we need to find the things that make positions valuable in fantasy football and attack those guys for no other reason than they're not on our opponent's roster, right? Because again, like going back to this year with Lamar Jackson, and I can bring this one up, Dak Prescott was either going undrafted or as like the quarterback 10. And I know because I drafted Dak in the 11th round of this year, and I still got sniped by the guy who picked up Lamar Jackson for free coming off of waivers. So like, just be advised, this 21 points doesn't really matter, relative to the next tier of guys that make such a big difference. And that becomes the big problem when you're going after these guys. To bring up our scoring from last year, I think it's this one. When we're looking at like Josh Allen, that relatively like 2 to 3 points a game becomes the difference between like Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts and those 15 touchdowns didn't really matter because Dak, with his 2 rushing touchdowns, 4,500 yards passing, 36 touchdowns, like he was basically able to go compete with Jalen Hurts. And if you spent like a 3rd round draft pick on a Jalen Hurts and the other guy either picked Dak off the waiver wire for free, or through that like late round desperation, 11th round draft pick on Dak, like he won, as long as he got the better guy going in the round that you pulled the trigger on Jalen Hurts. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about with these guys. Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, they went undrafted in most leagues. So like the guy objectively, and this is why I brought up Anthony Richardson, the guy to go out and get last year was actually Anthony Richardson at points per game, or excuse me, points per dropback. Because if he was able to stay healthy in the all or parts of 4 games that he played, like he would have been the quarterback 1. And he was relatively going in that area of Lamar Jackson, where he's going like undrafted to free agent. Now, the other guy to talk about in this that I would bring up is Kirk Cousins. If he hadn't got injured, and again, fantasy football, like injuries are part of it, Kirk Cousins would have led the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And again, you can see your scoring settings and my scoring settings may be a little bit different, but 19.4 points a game for Kirk Cousins. So that like the pure passer. And we can go compare that 19.4 that Kurt had to your Jared Goff doing 17.8. And then Tua, again, led the league in passing yards, 16.7. So, like, those high volume passing guys that aren't going to have rushing yards, like, I don't care about. Like, they may as well not exist to me until I need to desperation go after them on the waiver wire. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So, that first tier of guys that we could talk about, and I have my ESPN list is pretty to look at. We're generally going to be comparing the ECR for fantasy pros if I need to compare where guys are going in drafts. but in general, they're close enough at this point that it doesn't really matter. So I will let you guys stare at the pretty color paper than the white of the ECR. So anyway, with Josh Allen, the two things that we can talk about with these guys, like, can Josh Allen have high passing totals to go along with high rushing totals, a lot of total touchdowns? Yes, that's where he should be going. So when I talk about this with Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, I'm not saying that they're necessarily undervalued. They aren't. They're being appropriately valued. What I'm talking about is the other guys that have the same story are being undervalued relative to them. So I would rather go attack those guys knowing that I have basically the same ceiling as Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. That's what I would be talking about. Now, if I want to follow the meta, and the meta last year of landing elite quarterback, Josh Allen broke fantasy, I'm going to have to go up and get him. So in our Fantasy Pros League, I'm going to have to go up a round or so to get your Josh Allen. So if Josh Allen's going 21 overall, the ECR of Fantasy Pros, like, I'm getting very close to having to spend what would be a first round draft pick to secure a Josh Allen. An early second is where I would have to pull the trigger. And in a snake draft league, I have to make sure I have that pick. Part of what we're going to talk about from a strategy standpoint is in those snake draft leagues, I may not have the ability to go elite quarterback. It just may not be where that guy's going. And if my league mates don't magically allow that guy to fall to me, it doesn't matter. Like, it's nice to have. I may not get that opportunity, and that's okay, because I have so many more bites at this apple, again, relative to last year with like your Brock Purdy's, your Jordan Loves, and your Dak Prescott's. It probably doesn't matter, especially with Jalen Hurts being a punt, Lamar Jackson being a punt, and Patrick Mahomes being a bust last year. And those were like the top 4 quarterbacks. So again, I get this coin flip of whether or not I make the right call. That's not necessarily how I like to attack fantasy, but I would tier guys into the category, and I talked about this before, where can Josh Allen win me a league? Absolutely. So at this point, like, if he falls to me, I'm pulling the trigger. That's too easy. If he doesn't fall to me, I'm going to go a different direction. Can I tell the story about how Josh Allen busts? Yes. Can I tell the story about how Josh Allen has this like legendary Lamar Jackson type season? Yes, I can do that too. So, anybody trying to say otherwise, on a lot of these guys, like, I don't know what to tell you. If they have a fantasy, crystal ball, then, more power to them. But anyway, like Jalen Hurts, I'm expecting Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts rushing touchdowns to go down, because 15 is ridiculous. It doesn't matter what position they're playing. Again, touchdowns tend to be very volatile. Now, in the case of Jalen Hurts, the argument has been made about like the tush push and whether or not that's going to remain consistent. Sure. So Jalen Hurts could theoretically have this ridiculously high volume passing offense because of the new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore. That can occur, right? And then we can put that together with the tush push, and we can get this legendary outcome season. Yeah, go spend on your Jalen Hurts. Like, I'm not telling you not to. That's objectively the best way to go handle the position outside of the other meta, which is I'm just going to punt and go get someone later in the draft. Like, those are your two options. I get lucky, I have the right pick, or I'm going to go a different direction because I don't have that pick. Like, hey, that's just how easy it's going to go. I have Lamar Jackson as my quarterback 1 because when I look at the 2 ways that Lamar Jackson can get to where he's going to go to, I can tell that story where he has a career high in passing yards and passing touchdowns to go along with that relatively consistent, somewhere between like 1,200 yard rushing and 700-yard rushing that he's been generally doing. Probably not going to be the goal line guy. Some of the things that we're talking about with these guys, they did bring in Derrick Henry. So the rushing touchdowns is probably, as a ceiling, going to be lower than your Josh Allen's and your Jalen Hurts. The other thing to talk about with Josh Allen, they drafted Ray Davis, who's a big thumper, in the 4th round of the draft. So I would generally go like, hey, can I tell the story about how I'm overspending on Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, or Lamar Jackson, and I'm going to get this year's Patrick Mahomes? Yes. Now, the reason why I would tier these guys together is you're looking at that passing yardage and the rushing yardage combined to put us in a particular tier of guys with general touchdowns. That's why I would put them together as a tier. And in general, if I'm going to be looking at this from a fantasy perspective, Lamar Jackson probably should be ranked up towards Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, and Patrick Mahomes should probably be moved down here to your Joe Burrows, your Anthony Richardson, and Dak Prescott's. So that's part of the reason why I would look at it and say, like, I think that Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are a little bit overvalued because I could go attack the position someplace else and get that relatively similar range of outcomes. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the tight end position because there are 4 tight ends that I probably have to be attacking in my draft. The tight end position is really easy. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it generally has to do with the guy who can finish as the number one and the number two in his offense. And there's 4 of those guys that we can really look at in that draftability range, because I've already taken Sam Laporte and Travis Kelce off my board. So in this case, I would be weighing these elite level quarterbacks, that high end league winning range of outcomes quarterbacks, against my ability to go get like your Trey McBrides, your Dalton Kincaids, your Kyle Pitts, and your Mark Andrews. And that would be the main thing from a strategy perspective that I'm going to have to look at and go, well, which of these 2 guys am I going to have to pull the trigger on? Because I have to get one of these 4 tight ends, because one of these 4 tight ends has a road to finish as the number 1 or number 2 in their offense, right? And then I have to weigh that league-winning upside quarterback versus that league-winning upside tight end, and I can't allow my opponents to have those guys on their roster. It doesn't matter if I have already drafted like a Lamar Jackson. If I'm staring at, like, say, a Patrick Mahomes, I probably still got to pull the trigger on that guy, because I'm allowing someone else to compete with me when I can sabotage them. In the same way that when I'm looking at that tight end versus that quarterback, it's the same outcome of me not being able to have a league-winning upside versus my opponent having the ability to have that league-winning upside. So that's more than what I'm going to end up that's more than likely what I'm going to end up weighing when it comes to the next tier guys. And on Fantasy Pros, you may not have that big of an issue when it comes to Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, because they are going closer to those premium range. Outside of those guys, when you start looking at like your Anthony Richardson going at like quarterback 6, now you're starting to talk about like outside of those top 5 or top 50 picks, which usually end up being like a coin flip. Now I'm in this range where I can really start splurging a little bit more. I could take in a little bit more risk, because it's more than likely not going to affect my ability to win a league unless I start hitting on picks. If I bust on those picks, it becomes very difficult to go like, hey, I drafted a guy who that's a wide receiver 3 and I got a wide receiver 3. Okay, like it's not gonna kill me. If I draft a wide receiver 2 and I get a wide receiver 3, like I'm behind the 8 ball. So once I get like to pick 50, I can take either multiple tight ends or multiple quarterbacks, provided they tell me the story that I can win my league on, right? So the next tier of guys that I'll be talking about is Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, and Dak Prescott. And the main thing that these are the same guys about is that you're looking at like higher volume passing. Again, Dak led everybody last year with 36 touchdowns. They're all going to be plus or minus 4,500 yards passing, 30 touchdowns, some rushing upside. So as guys get older, their rushing upside goes down. We can tell the story about how Dak has this magical rushing touchdown season because the running backs for the Cowboys are bad. We can tell that story. We could tell the story about how Joe Burrow doesn't end up being the slight bit of nimbly bimbly that he's been in the past because he's old and he's nicked up. And we could tell the story about how Patrick Mahomes, like I am expecting that Patrick Mahomes does have a very good chance to have 5,000 yards passing, 40 touchdowns, stay relatively consistent in that 300-yard rushing range, and then have that quote unquote positive regression in the rushing touchdown department. That's all there with Patrick Mahomes. Why I would put him in the same tier of these guys is because, like, well, he didn't do that last year, and these guys relatively are similar from a play style perspective of having higher volume passing and a little bit of nimbly bimbly. That's what you're looking at with Patrick Mahomes. Now, if you think Patrick Mahomes should be in the next tier of quarterbacks, like, okay, fine. Like, I'm not going to argue with you about that. I understand why he's there. But again, the cheat code for fantasy is rushing yards or rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. And if Patrick Mahomes doesn't do that, because he's not Lamar Jackson and he's not some of the other guys we're going to talk about, he's in a different tier. Because if you put him in that other tier last year, you busted. You picked the wrong guy when you went and got Patrick Mahomes. So relative to, can we get this like 5,000 yard 40 touchdown season that he did in 2022? Yes. But when you bought that in 2023, that range of outcomes, again, because you're not buying last year's production, you're buying this year's range of outcomes. That range of outcomes hit the floor of what he could do last year. So all these guys, they could all do like 4,000 yards passing. If Joe Burrow's healthy, he could do 4,000 yards passing, like 20-something touchdowns. He could have a bad year. He could also have a league-winning year, where he does 5,000 yards passing and 40 touchdowns. Like, if you know something I don't, go ahead. But in that case, that's generally how we're going to do it. Now, the other thing is to talk about these top 6 guys, and I'm only going to talk a little bit about stacking. I like stacking. It's not something I would be changing my draft about. So, like, if I land a Jamar Chase early on, and I have to look at a of this group of guys, and they're all staring me at the face, and I have they're staring me in the face, and I have Lamar Jackson, or I have Jamar Chase, and Joe Burrow's there. Like that might end up being the feather that tips the scales in the direction of what quarterback I go in. That's fine. Again, they're all the same guy to me, because I could tell the story about how they can win me a league. I can't really tell the story how they're going to have a legendary outcome season, unless like something changes between like how defenses are playing teams in the NFL. Again, 4,600 yards, 36 touchdowns if we combine Tua and Dak without the rushing yards, right? So the rushing yards ends up being a big deal, and that's why this tier of guys ends up being the cheat code for me to win my league, right? So Anthony Richardson, again, we talked about this. He played all or part of 4 games, 4 rushing touchdowns. That's all I got to know. Ceiling for Anthony Richardson, passing wise, is probably not going to be as high as say Josh Allen. 4,000 yards, probably going to be there. 30 touchdowns, probably going to be there. May have a little bit of turnovers, but you're looking at somewhere between like 600 to 1,000 yards rushing, and you generally could be flirting with like 10 rushing touchdowns. That's going to be a lot. That's going to allow you to push up, and I can bring our scoring settings up. That's going to allow you to probably push more into this Jalen Hurts range. And the upside to this is if I went out and I get Jalen Hurts at like 25 overall on Fantasy Pros, like I'm going to be spending a second round draft pick to get Jalen Hurts. When it comes to the perspective of Anthony Richardson in a Fantasy Pros league, he's going pick 50. That means I'm going to be jumping up pick 45, pick 40 overall to get the same type of theoretical, or pretty close to the same type of ceiling as Jalen Hurts. Now, I do think that Jalen Hurts has a slightly higher ceiling overall, but I don't think there's going to be that big a difference, especially for the cost. Now, what bothers me more with Anthony Richardson, I'll bring this up real quick, is if he starts falling in drafts, and like I bring up ESPN in particular, if he goes 63 overall, there's no way I want to let a league-winning guy go in a draft, even if I'm not that excited about Anthony Richardson, because I'm more excited about other guys, especially at cost. Like, I don't want Anthony Richardson to line up on other people's roster. That's why I bring up the tight ends, because in this case, like your Mark Andrews and your Trey McBrides may have unicorn type seasons. Your Dalton Kincaids might have unicorn type seasons. Those would be the only guys that would really pique my interest outside of Anthony Richardson. If I'm in a league where I get to about this range, and I'm looking at your like my Zamir Whites, your Ramondres, and your Jonathan Brooks, like I'm not sure that these guys necessarily have like league winning upside in the way that like your Dalton Kincaid has like a unicorn legendary type season as the number 1 attached to Josh Allen. And that's where the strategy would come into it, going like, well, you're forcing me to take a league winner if he falls to me at like pick 63, right? And one of my big things with Anthony Richardson, why I don't think I'm going to end up getting him, is once he starts pushing up towards this Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes tier of guys, and I'll bring this up, if guys aren't going up and attacking Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson early because they have that league winning range of outcomes, and they follow this range, I would probably feel a little bit safer about going after Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. If someone wants to go up and put Anthony Richardson in this tier, they're trying to win a league, right? And I would respect that. Otherwise, like I don't know where he's going to magically fall to me at ADP, because I generally think that you're going to have like half the people in your league that are like Anthony Richardson is a cheat code, league winning upside. I have to go get him, and the other half of the league are going to be like, I don't know how I feel about him. He's too risky, and I'm just going to let him be someone else's problem. And that becomes the difficulty of you deciding where you lie when it comes to Anthony Richardson and that like 4,000 yard passing season with like 40 combined touchdowns and 800 yards rushing, which would be the equivalent of being like, a 6,000 yard passer. So, just remember that you have the ability to get like similar to that Peyton Manning type season, going all the way back here to 2013. You can push towards this level with an Anthony Richardson. And there's going to be very few guys that are going to have that ceiling when we talk about some of these quarterbacks, especially with how the league is running right now. So the next guy up, Kyler Murray. I really like Kyler Murray. He's going to be like Jalen Hurts light when it comes to, we could tell a story how he has career highs in passing and touchdowns and rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, because he's done it before. Like his 2020, 800 yards rushing, 11 touchdowns, 3,900 yards passing, 26 touchdowns. Remember, Jalen Hurts is not thrown for 4,000 yards. and he has not thrown for 30 touchdowns. You're primarily buying the rushing, and that's what you're getting out of Kyler Murray. The difference for me, and to visualize this, is Jalen Hurts is going to go like in the second round of drafts. Kyler Murray is going to fall to where he falls. Now, on Fantasy Pros, I looked this up beforehand. Kyler Murray is going 64. I don't know how many people are going to go up and get Kyler Murray at like 54 overall, right? Go up around to get Kyler Murray. If he's falling to me at like 79 overall, like, oh no, you're giving me a guy with league winning upside because of that rushing ability. And to bring again this up with our stats last year, Kyler Murray in those 8 games that he played, I mean, he was fine. He's like 18 points a game. 18 points a game is going to give you the ability to punt. If I could go hunt him down. Kyler Murray, 18.9. 18.9 is going to give you the ability to punt at the position relative to his cost. That's fine. And remember, the guys that were going last year, like your Bryce Purdy, like he's in that range. Your Jordan Love, he's going in that range. Like 18.9 points a game relative to Dak Prescott, what he did at 20.7 points a game. They're similar enough that it doesn't matter. The only difference between these two guys last year would be Dak was going in the range that Kyler is going this year. Dak this year is going multiple rounds higher to get relatively the same middle range of outcome, that same mean when it comes to fantasy perspective. All right. Moving on. Jayden Daniels. Jayden Daniels and Caleb Williams, they have different ways to get to where we want them to get to. Generally, it's like, hey, how risky are they going to be? They're rookies. No one knows. So anybody saying like, well, I don't like this guy, I don't like that guy, that conversation has sailed so much in the last 10 years. People were wrong and they were right on your Patrick Mahomes and your Josh Allens when it came to like how good at actual football they're going to be. Justin Herbert, everyone thought he was going to be a bust. We were all wrong. He was, from a fantasy football perspective, a league winner as a rookie. So trying to listen to anybody go like, well, I just don't like this guy, he just wasn't that good. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because as long as Jayden Daniels hits a particular number in the rushing yardage department, it doesn't matter. And I can bring this one up right here. It doesn't matter if he's Bryce Young. It doesn't matter if he does 2,800 yards passing and 11 touchdowns. If he does 800 yards rushing and he does like 6 touchdowns, you're going to have a punt at his cost, because Jayden Daniels is going outside of where he should be going relative to that range of outcomes where we could theoretically be pushing towards that Lamar Jackson season. And again, to bring up this Lamar Jackson type season, when we convert this overall from 1,200 yards rushing into passing yards, right, we can go like, hey, Lamar Jackson, 4,000 yards passing, which is going to be 800 yards rushing. Can we tell the story where Jayden Daniels does 4,000 yards passing, 800 yards rushing this year? Yes. So again, if we're buying that range of outcomes because we're trying to win our league, it just becomes an issue of cost versus that risk. If Jayden Daniels, to bring this one back up, if Jayden Daniels was going around pick 63 or pick 50 where Anthony Richardson was going, I'd be like, that's where he's appropriately valued. That's where he's appropriately valued. That's a little risky. It's a little risky, but yeah, there's league winning upside. When your Jayden Daniels are going like 111 on ESPN, or he's going as an ECR of 98 on Fantasy Pros, like, yeah, I will take that gamble that I could theoretically, at the very least, and I don't even have to be right about him doing 2019 Lamar Jackson. I can just be right that he's close to 2023 Josh Allen when it comes to total touchdowns and total yards. That's all that really matters when it comes down to that. So I do like the situation. The Redskins did try and give him weapons, and they did try and upgrade the offensive line. That's all I need to know on that one. So the whole like, well, Cliff Kingsbury, he's the offense coordinator. Don't care. Why? Because this isn't a real life football channel. It's like, what are the statistical upside to Jayden Daniels relative to the cost? That's all I have to be able to tell myself. The other thing when I talk about this from a strategy perspective is a guy like Jayden Daniels, and we're going to talk about Justin Herbert, Jayden Daniels, even Kirk Cousins, Caleb Williams, and Trevor Lawerence, even Deshaun Jackson. These guys can all win leagues in the same way that these other guys wins leagues. Over here, like your Lamar Jackson, your Patrick Mahomes, your Jalen Hurts, your Josh Allen. The problem that you run into, and again, I'm going to throw Patrick Mahomes under the bus. The guys that were wrong last year on Patrick Mahomes, they busted. They put themselves further back to win a league than before they did their draft, right? And in this case, when we start looking at these guys, why would I allow Jayden Daniels to be on someone else's roster knowing what his range of outcomes is? And that's why I brought up this 2019 season. Why would I allow Dak Prescott at 21 points a game, quarterback 2, to be on someone else's roster where he was relatively going either undrafted or late in the drafts, with Lamar Jackson also being on the board. And remember, Lamar Jackson was basically going undrafted this year or close to it. So I could have had both Lamar Jackson and Dak Prescott and cornered the market on these guys in a way that, because I don't want to give my opponents the ability to win my league. So it just becomes that simple when it comes to drafting these guys. Like, if I punt and I wind up with Jayden Daniels as my quarterback one, I'm happy. If I don't punt and Jayden Daniels is on the bottom of my bench, I'm blocking my opponent. It's not rocket science at this point. So the other thing is with Caleb Williams, and I bring up Jayden Daniels. So Jayden Daniels, you're looking at the rushing yards combined with rushing touchdowns. So he did 6, 11, 10, and then he did 710, 885, 1100. I don't think it's necessarily going to transfer over apples to apples into the NFL. So you're probably getting closer to like 600 yards rushing on the season. Again, if you can stay healthy, blah, blah, blah. Injuries are a part of football. The thing is with Caleb Williams is you're not necessarily buying the rushing yards. The rushing yards went down when he was in college between Oklahoma and USC. You're buying the rushing touchdowns. That, again, guys like, going back to Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, the 15 rushing touchdowns that we're expecting to go down, you're buying the theoretical possibility at the cost that the Bears will use Caleb Williams as a goal line running back or goal line fullback to score rushing touchdowns. And again, two things that we want. We want total touchdowns and we want rushing yards. So Caleb Williams gives us a better opportunity than some of the other quarterbacks to get total touchdowns if they use him in the same role that he was used in college. That's what we generally have to talk about. Then it just becomes an issue of price shopping. And when I look at Caleb Williams going 99 on Fantasy Pros or on ESPN going at 113, it's really easy for me to go, you know what I'm looking at? I'm looking at a guy that has not within the realm of possibilities, that range of outcomes to finish as this sub-elite type of tier of quarterbacks. Now, again, doesn't matter, hey, how good at football he is. Doesn't matter, like, we don't know how good the offense is going to be. It is that possibility at the price it's going to go, and I'm going to weigh that against the other guys that are out there. And that's why I have the tight end still pulled up. That's why I have this list of my targets right now. For me to go out there and pull the trigger on a Caleb Williams, it would be like, well, am I missing on a running back 2, right, with your Zach Charbonnets or your Ty Chandlers? Or, would I have to be deciding if I want to go Ladd McConkey? Now, Ladd McConkey over Caleb Williams, I might go Ladd McConkey at that point in the draft, but I'm also going to be going up and making sure I get a Ladd McConkey or a Brian Thomas Jr. They may not be in this range. The only guy with league-winning upside in this range may end up being a Caleb Williams, and I'm going to pull that trigger because I'm not going to let a sub-elite quarterback be on someone else's roster. And this has nothing to do with whether or not I'm in leagues that actually trade. It has to do with the ability for that guy to win a league is different than me putting another wide receiver 2 or running back 2 or wide receiver 3 on my roster, because those guys tend to grow on trees in a way that these elite or sub-elite or league-winning quarterbacks do not. All right, moving on to this next tier, guys. So the next tier, guys, like, we could tell the story about how Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, and CJ Stroud are all league MVP. If you know something I don't, then go ahead and go up and overdraft these guys when you're league. The reason why I would tier these guys together is you're not buying the rushing yards that you need to, even though they theoretically could have that like 5,000-yard passing season and 40 touchdowns. Like the league MVP, real life league MVP could be Jordan Love, could be Brock Purdy, could be CJ Stroud. I would almost put CJ Stroud in the next tier. We'll talk about that here in a second. But in general, it just becomes an issue of price, and they're all fine, except for CJ Stroud, who I think is overvalued, because the way he gets there ends up being you're drafting him for the ceiling of him being a league winner or a real life league MVP. And that's why, like, I have him blue here. CJ Stroud going like 62 overall. On Fantasy Pros, he's going a more ridiculous 46. And if I have to choose between the 46 CJ Stroud with the lack of rushing upside and the 50 Anthony Richardson with all that rushing touchdowns, I know which one I'm going to go with. And that's why I would put these guys down here. I'm being a little generous when it comes to CJ Stroud. That's why I have this one pulled up with CJ Stroud. When he was in college, like, you're looking at senior year, 108 rushing yards on 47 attempts. So this outlier that he did in his rookie year in the NFL, this 140 or 167, 3 touchdowns, like, I don't know how much that's something that is going to remain consistent. And remember, touchdowns tend to be volatile. So I would be going after this like massive statistical step forward in the passing game. And you're looking at something like 1,000 yards passing increase to go along with 10 to 20 touchdowns increases. Now, am I saying that can't happen? No, I'm just saying that like the possibility of that occurring to me relative to the other guys that I could be going after later in the draft, like a Jayden Daniels, for Jayden Daniels to be able to get there, again, to break down, where's it at? This one right here, or it's actually this one right here. When we look at how Patrick Mahomes got there with 5,200 yards passing, 41 touchdowns. Yeah, we can say that CJ Stroud can do that. What I don't think CJ Stroud is going to be able to do on top of that to push him into that like legendary or so close to that tier of quarterbacks is I don't think he's going to get 358 and 4 rushing touchdowns, because that's generally not what he did in college, right? So you're looking at this very hard to predict season for CJ Stroud to return where he's going. You're buying his ceiling. I like buying guys' floors. That's why I would generally like Jayden Daniels over this. All right. Going back, I think I talked about this. And then Brock Purdy, because rushing touchdowns, because touchdowns tend to be so volatile, you could see this theoretical like 5 to 10 touchdown increase in the passing game, especially because like he's taking rushing touchdowns away from Christian McCaffrey because he's the one who throws them. That can occur. I just don't generally think you're going to get enough of the rushing to really make him a league winner at cost. And you're looking at 78 on Fantasy Pros, which I think is a little rich compared to where I can get some of the other league winning guys, because he would be a punt. I'm not going to be able to win you a league, just a punt. And then 80 on ESPN. Again, he's going to be a punt. I would still take like Kyler Murray's ability to win me a league over Brock Purdy at that point on ESPN. On Fantasy Pros, you're looking at, if I'm going to go, Brock Purdy at 78. And again, a lot of these guys are just going to come down. If they fall to me in this range and there's no other league winning guys like a tight end, or maybe if I get some of these other like few wide receiver running backs that may have that road to win me a league, I'm going to pull the trigger on a tight end or on a quarterback. So in the case of Brock Purdy going like 78 overall, like Kyle Pitts is staring at me in the face. Like I'm going to pull the trigger on a second tight end, Kyle Pitts, over a Brock Purdy at this range in the draft, because Kyle Pitts can win me a league. He can win my opponent in a league. Brock Purdy ain't going to win anybody in any leagues. Like, unless you can tell the story where Brock Purdy throws for 5,000 yards passing and 40 touchdowns, like I just don't see that happening, because he's just not going to have the rushing upside to get me there in general. So probably would be pivoting to another guy. And even in a Fantasy Pros type league where Brock Purdy's going like 78, I got Jayden Daniels, Caleb Williams, Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawerence, Kirk Cousins, all still available as my quarterback one, even if I'm in a league where everybody's getting backstabbed. And again, like my main money league, I would be imagining that I'm going to get like 18 quarterbacks going off the board in a one quarterback league, because those guys are going to be drafting all the upside quarterbacks that can win leagues. They draft all those tight ends, they draft all those quarterbacks, because they're not trying to. They've learned from their mistakes of allowing league winners to be on the waiver wire, right? So like the only guy that was a league winner on our waiver wire last year was pretty much like Kyren Williams, because everybody was wrong on that. So just be advised like how competitive your league is and how much you're going to have to go after some of these guys. All right. So this tier of guys, I would just say, maybe with the exception of Kirk Cousins, I would take off my board. Like they can't win me leagues. They should not be drafted outside of like 2 quarterback leagues. I generally don't talk about 2 quarterback leagues. These guys are not going to be able to do it. Even if you get that league winning Jared Goff season, that Tua season, they're just not going to be able to give you any rushing upside. And again, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying to win your league. If you punt on Jared Goff or Tua, even if you get league MVP Tua, you get league MVP Goff. Like they're not going to have the 385 4 touchdowns that Patrick Mahomes did in 2022 to put him in that tier. So that's just the simple way about it. You're pushing 20 points a game, Jared Goff, Tua, and more than likely these guys should end up being on the waiver wire start the season off because of the lack of the story to tell how they win leagues. All right, sip of water. All right, so Aaron Rodgers, I'm going to talk about him real quick. Like we could theoretically get the season where he can have higher volume passing touchdowns. Overall, I think he's going to be limited. The reason why I would put him up so far is because of where he's ranked on ESPN. He's going as quarterback 12, 81 overall. Not going to have any rushing upside, more than likely because of the Achilles. He is going 120 on Fantasy Pros, if you're wondering. So I put him up here because we can maybe tell the story with Aaron Rodgers where he does get like 40 passing touchdowns. And then when we look at what Goff did with 30 and Tua did at 29, we could get a similar statistical or fantasy production from Aaron Rodgers because he throws more touchdown passes, even though Tua and Goff have higher passing yardage, if that makes any sense. Now, the one caveat to all this with Kirk Cousins is, remember, this is basically the Rams offense that has been grafted over to Atlanta with Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Darnell Mooney, Bijan Robinson. That's what we're generally looking at. Kirk Cousins was on the one of the higher volume passing offenses in the league last year with the Vikings. I think I have something along the lines that pulled up last year. So all the ridiculousness that went on with the Vikings, and this is going to come up again when we talk about with the Vikings quarterbacks, they were still was it 5 overall when it came to yards per game last year. So Kirk Cousins, before he got injured, was on pace to finish as the league leader in passing yards and passing touchdowns. Now, I usually don't like projecting out what could have happened from what did happen, but from a fantasy perspective, something they talk about, like you could get the league leader in passing touchdowns and passing yardage in Kirk Cousins, and he's going outside of draftability in most leagues. So he's going 110 in Fantasy Pros. On ESPN, he's going all the way down here at like 112. Like, that guy still exists. And the main reason why I bring him up is I don't necessarily have to hit on one of these other guys, even that Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott tier of guys, Jordan Love, because Kirk Cousins is still there. And is it going to surprise anybody when he finishes as this year's Joe Flacco? No. So just remember that guy exists later on in my drafts. And then finally, Matt Stafford, another guy that's not going to have the rushing upside, even though theoretically, we can tell that like league MVP type of season that he had, like 2021, 4,800 yards passing, 41 touchdowns. It's there. Like, I just don't know how much I would be chasing the guys that don't have the rushing upside, because again, we can tell the story with certain guys that we could get like 45 to 4,800 yards passing and 4 to 8 rushing, 400 to 800 rushing yards on top of that. So these guys are not going to generally have the ability to win leagues unless everybody else is a bust. All those other lottery tickets are bust. Now, these two guys, Justin Herbert and Trevor Lawerence, are probably the best overall value when it comes to cost and their ability to win leagues. So I've heard a lot of pundits talk about Justin Herbert and, the Chargers may end up being the lowest volume passing attack in the league. Doesn't matter. So that's a really bad argument, because when we can look at like the San Francisco 49ers, and I can bring this up real quick, the 49ers were the lowest passing volume in the league at 449 or 491. You know what else they were? They were the most efficient offense when it came to yards per attempt last year at 9.3. So that doesn't matter. The Baltimore Ravens, the team that led the league in rushing attempts last year, they were at 494. They were also pretty efficient at 7.9. So these things do not need to go together. We can get a very good rushing attack that allows a very efficient passing attack, and we can still get Justin Herbert to get to where he needs to get to from a total touchdown perspective, on top of getting just enough passing yardage. The other thing that makes Justin Herbert really interesting is this Jim Harbaugh offense that just got done having design quarterback runs with J.J. McCarthy at Michigan. Justin Herbert being this slightly deceptively nimbly bimbly quarterback, 302 in 2021 with 3 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns in 2020, 2023 in only 13 games. He had three rushing touchdowns, 228. We could get design quarterback runs because this same offense had design quarterback runs with Greg Roman when he was the offensive coordinator for San Francisco under Harbaugh, with Colin Kaepernick and with Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. So just remember that, like, we can get Justin Herbert to get enough rushing yards and enough design quarterback work in the red zone to have a league-winning upside guy. That's the long and short of it. And where he's going in drafts, and again, he's going as 101 on Fantasy Pros and on ESPN, and this is what makes it like really interesting, like 110 overall. So I can either go into the season as Justin Herbert as my dart throw quarterback 1, but I also need to know that there is a league-winning upside in Justin Herbert. Like, we could tell that story where he has, something along the lines of that combined yardage total to put him in that like 5,000 passing yards number. Again, not real number, but from a fantasy perspective, we convert the rushing yards into passing yards, plus the amount of touchdowns needed to move him into the next tier. We can already tell that with Justin Herbert, even if they're in a lower volume passing offense that's higher in run. Because if they're generally a better offense, they're going to have more red zone opportunities. And now we can get a guy that can score more rushing touchdowns, because those rushing touchdowns are more valuable than the passing touchdowns are, in most leagues. So moving on to the other guy in this tier is just Trevor Lawerence. This is another one that, like, can we tell the story where Trevor Lawerence ends up, like, being league MVP? Absolutely. Can we tell the story where he moves into that next tier of passers in that, like, 4,500 yard, 30 to 40 touchdown tier? And I'm going to bring up these guys: Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott. We could tell that on top of that. He hasn't done it yet, but are we betting against that relative to his cost? That becomes the problem. The other thing with Trevor Lawerence is generally just how he's played since he came out of college. You're looking at something along like of 300 rushing yards to go along with like 2 rushing touchdowns in 2021 and 5 in 2022. He had 4 last year. So you're likely going to get Trevor Lawerence calling his number like somewhere around 3 times with 3 rushing touchdowns. And if we could tell the story of that increase in passing yards and passing touchdowns, you got a sub-elite guy. You have Dak Prescott this year. Now, then we just have to go, hey, what's the price on Trevor Lawerence? Well, he's going 102 on Fantasy Pros all the way down here, and he's going quarterback 17. So in your one quarterback leagues, there's going to be a lot of guys that are like, Trevor Lawerence is really stinky cheese. I'm going to stay away from him. Okay, let him do that. Like, I can tell the story where he's this year's Dak Prescott, and it costs me nothing to be wrong, and pivot to the next tier guys that we're going to talk about if I'm wrong on these guys. Otherwise, I can get Joe Burrow, I can get Patrick Mahomes, that middle of the range of outcomes. Remember, like 4,600 yards, 36 touchdowns. That's what happened last year. That's generally something that we would be predicting forward. Plus, I get 300 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Like, that's generally what I could be looking at, putting him in this tier of guys with your Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, and Dak Prescott. But I'm going to be saving somewhere along the lines of like 50 picks on ESPN. All right. These guys I'm going to generally talk about and say, like, I'm not interested in, even though we have to tell the story about like Deshaun Watson's rushing upside, Daniel Jones's rushing upside, and Russell Wilson's rushing upside. I'm imagining that the Giants and the Steelers are going to be relatively slow, even though there could be some rushing upside to that. Their rushing numbers have got to be high enough to offset for the fact that these are likely going to be run-heavy offenses that are not very efficient, very slow. They're going to be like, I think the Giants are going to be bad. I think the Steelers are going to be okay. Deshaun Watson is a little bit more interesting because we could get this highest neutral pass rate offense that is how the Browns finished last year, even though their OC left and went to the Patriots. But we can tell that story where he's got like quarterback 5 because he's done it before. Like, I generally do not like chasing guys from a fantasy perspective when they haven't done it before, but I can tell the story about how it could happen. On Fantasy Pros, he's going at where's he at? Like 131, so he's probably not going to be drafted in most leagues. And then ESPN, he's going at like 135, 1 pick before Trevor Lawerence. So like, not going to get drafted, but he's a guy that I go like, well, if I miss on all of my other guys, he's going to be available. He's not going to be surprising if he is a top 10 quarterback, and I'm going to not have to pay anything to find out from a fantasy perspective. Let's see. Next group of guys. So the 2 things that we're looking at total touchdowns and rushing yards. So I bring up Drake May if he wins the job with the Patriots. So his last 2 years in college, like 698, 7 touchdowns. 2023, 449 and 9 touchdowns. That's in 14 games and 12 games. We can project that number is going to relatively stay somewhat consistent. Could be a little bit lower, could be a little bit higher. In this case, all we really need to know about with Drake May is he at least checks the box theoretically on one of the 2 things that we need. And that's like the ability to score rushing touchdowns and have that 300 to 400 rushing yards is likely going to translate. Then it just becomes an issue of like, is he actually good at football? Well, it doesn't actually matter at this rate, because the cost is going to, what's going to cost me to find out with Drake May is going to be like $199 on ESPN. I don't even think I have him written down on Fantasy Pros because he's not even projected to start. So the biggest thing is two things. If he's going to be projected to start, yeah, he's got league winner written on him. The other thing is, if he's not projected to start, he's a guy that he'll probably eventually earn the job this year with the Patriots. And if that offense can just move a little bit into that next tier of like, okay, if Drake May is like not bad at football, if he's not Bryce Young, you're looking at a guy that can at least be a replacement level quarterback with upside because of that rushing ability. And that's generally all I'm looking for. If he finishes as this tier of quarterbacks like Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, no one should be surprised at this point. Like, we know the things that have to occur for a guy to be able to hit those points. He checks one of those boxes. I'm a little bit less interested in him. Same thing with Bo Nix. Or we can talk about Bo Nix here. This one, who's this? This is JJ McCarthy. Bo Nix. So his 5 years in college, you're looking at like him being able to score rushing touchdowns. That's theoretically there. This is the same offense that has been higher passing volume back when Sean Payton was with the Saints. We can tell that story. Again, this is highly theoretical. If Bo Nix wins the job in this offense, coming off the waiver wire, would not advise going after a Bo Nix. The two guys, Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy, doesn't matter who wins the job. Whoever wins the job is going to have league-winning upside on this one. That's why I have JJ McCarthy with this quarterback usage winning that Michigan. 306 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns. This is a low volume or low rushing or low passing volume offense. This is a lot of these plays that he had were designed quarterback plays. 5 rushing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns. The only thing that really matters when it comes to JJ McCarthy, if he wins the job, and whether it's JJ McCarthy or Sam Darnold, they're going to have enough rushing upside in that 300 to 400 rushing yard range to matter, because this is when we can go over to offenses and find out that this is going to be a higher volume passing offense. 356 with all the quarterback shenanigans. So whoever actually ends up winning the job, I'm going to go, it should be borderline draftable because of that range to go like, yeah, we could get like 4,500 yards passing, 30 touchdowns to go along with 300 or 400 yards passing and 3 to 5 rushing touchdowns. That can be there with either of the Minnesota Vikings offense. The bigger issue behind all this, when we look at like why these guys are inappropriately valued, is why would you have Justin Jefferson at 8 overall on ESPN, and then over on Fantasy Pros, he's relatively going in the same range. Everybody's expecting that Justin Jefferson, he's going 5 overall on Fantasy Pros. They're expecting that Justin Jefferson is going to be good, even though they're expecting the quarterbacks. Like, one of these things is not like the other, right? Because remember last year with Garrett Wilson was so bad, even though he was a fringe first-round draft pick because of the backup quarterback situation. If these guys are actually this bad, Justin Jefferson should be a wide receiver 3. That's all I have to say on that one. So otherwise, you're looking at the possibility of this year's Kirk Cousins, to bring this one up. You're looking at this year's Kirk Cousins, lead the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns to go along with a higher rushing floor with JJ McCarthy or Sam Darnold, whoever ends up with the job. If both guys end up splitting time, they're both going to have the ability to be top 10 quarterbacks on a week-to-week basis. All right. Talking about Bo Nix, Will Levis. This is one of the other things with Will Levis. You're buying the possibility he's going to be used as a goal line fullback and then be a part of a higher passing volume passing offense. Probably not going to get the overall rushing numbers to go along with that, like probably like 200-300 yards maybe. But the theoretical possibility that he's going to be the guy that punches it in and gets in that like 6 to 10 rushing touchdown range. So like, yeah, you're looking at like hairband Josh Allen to rip off underdog again. That's the possibility that you could get with these two things. Higher turnovers, that's going to be there. And I know that this guy's probably going to go undrafted in a lot of one quarterback leagues. Geno Smith is another one. I'm going to have just enough nimbly for it to matter. He did 366 in 2022 when he finished his quarterback 5, 4,200 yards, 3 touchdowns. That's going to be there. He's going to go undrafted. I don't have to panic on the quarterback position. I can let it fall to me. If the guy meets the right criteria, I can let that guy fall to me. If that guy doesn't show up, I know I have so many bites at the apple to get a functional quarterback, like this 18-point a game quarterback, this 18, 19-point a game quarterback. I'm going to have so many bites at this apple. It doesn't matter. So unless I'm willing to go up and spend on a Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts or Lamar Jackson, it probably doesn't matter. I got so many other chances, at so many other points in the draft to see if that guy falls to me, or see if like an Anthony Richardson I want to go up around. If I want to go up on a Jayden Daniels, I can go up around. It doesn't really matter. And then this last tier, guys, Bryce Young's probably not going to have the rushing upside. I've talked about this before. He was never a rusher in college. This 253 was kind of an outlier. Maybe he can keep that. But you're also looking at him to be relevant. He's got to have to basically double his passing yardage and like triple his passing touchdown for it to matter. So like that's the long and short of it with him. Probably going to be sneakier in 2 quarterback leagues than anything else. Baker May, again, not going to have enough of the passing yards and the passing touchdowns more than likely to go along with what his theoretical rushing ceiling would be. Derek Carr, same way. Like maybe we can get Derek Carr to do 2021 like 4,800 yards and we could go like 30 touchdowns. Like that could occur, but he's not going to put together the rushing yards to put you in this Dak, Joe Burrow type of tier guys. So like he can be gone. I don't even have to think about him. And Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew, it doesn't really matter at this point. Like, yeah, we all know Gardner Minshew is going to be finished as quarterback 1 overall, but they're not going to have enough passing volume, and neither of them are going to have enough rushing upside when it comes to that in general. So how I would end up looking at my board when I look at these guys, like I want to make sure that I get Anthony Richardson at cost. I might go up a little bit on Kyler Murray because of that rushing upside. I definitely would go up on Jayden Daniels because of that rushing upside at the cost that he's going. So you're looking at somewhere around somewhere along the range of like 88 overall on Fantasy Pros. Like I'd have to go up around. So like in my snake draft leagues, I got to know what my pick is going to be in that range, and then that's going to have to be the pick. So I might have to go up a little bit higher than I really want to get a guy with that league winning upside. Caleb Williams is another guy that I probably would not be going after early, but if he falls to me in this range, like I'm probably going to be scooping him up. Like Jayden Daniels and Anthony Richardson, Kyler Murray, because of the price, like I want to make sure that if those guys are on the board, I'm going to put them in. I'm going to make sure they're not on someone else's roster at that point. Your Justin Herbert, who I do like, I can tell that story, and I do like the Trevor Lawerence. I do like those guys. I don't know how much I necessarily have to be running 2 quarterbacks at that point. If I'm running 2 quarterbacks at that point with like a Trevor Lawerence or Justin Herbert, it's because I'm a little scared of the upside or the risk of your Jayden Daniels and your Anthony Richardson. And I wouldn't feel bad about doing that relative to the other guys that I would be passing on to run 2 quarterbacks in 1 quarterback leagues to make sure that I'm right and my opponent's wrong. So anyway, I believe that's about all I got for the quarterback position. And yeah,